Good morning from the US East Coast. I am Rudabe Shahid, a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council's South Asia Center. It is my honor and privilege to moderate this important event on COVID-19 and the tourism sector of the Himalayan and Indian Ocean countries of South Asia. The tourism industry of South Asia saw approximately 47.7 million travel and tourism jobs being affected. In 2019, while tourism was among the fastest growing sectors, the pandemic resulted in losses of over 50 billion US dollars to the region's GDP. In particular, the Maldives, Bhutan, Sri Lanka, and Nepal saw between 70 to 80% reduction in tourist arrivals in 2020. To explore these issues, the Atlantic Council's South Asia Center brought together a panel of experts to discuss COVID-19 and the future of tourism in the Himalayan and Indian Ocean countries of South Asia. Without further ado, I will now introduce our guests and proceed to our discussion. First, we have with us Dr. Aishat Shakila, a senior lecturer at Griffith Business School at Griffith University in Brisbane, Australia. Second, we are joined by Dr. Manoj Samarathunga, senior lecturer, Faculty of Management Studies, Rajaratha University of Sri Lanka. Our third guest today is Mr. Saurav Raj Pant, CEO, National Study Center, Kathmandu, Nepal. Last but not least, we have with us Mr. Damcho Rinzin, Chief Tourism Officer, Tourism Promotion Division, Tourism Council of Bhutan. So thank you all for joining us today. I will begin by asking everybody for quick overviews of the situation in the four countries that we will be talking about today and know about currently where we stand. So first of all, I will go to Dr. Shakila. As we know, the Maldives faces a serious threat of rising sea levels. Many have predicted that the nation could even disappear by the turn of the next century. We would like to know how the climate crisis and the recent COVID-19 pandemic intersected to shape tourism in the Maldives. So thank you.
Thank you for the invitation. So if we are looking at climate change risks and crisis and COVID pandemic, these are two interconnected shocks that is facing the Maldives. Tourism is the economic pillar for the Maldives and many other small island countries. In 2019, before the full force of the pandemic hit, Maldives tourism contributed 26% to the GDP. And over 35% of foreign revenue was also generated from tourism alone. It is very true that the Maldives is at the very forefront of the global climate crisis that we are facing today. We know from recent IPCC report that even with 1.5 degrees Celsius global warming, there would be heavy changes in precipitation, and also other climate-induced risks within the Southeast Asian region and also other parts of the globe. So when we consider Maldives being one of the lowest lying countries on the earth, with the highest point of 1.5 meters above sea level, we are looking at a high risk scenario here. Already local communities and enclave resort islands are facing the reality of climate threats. These include increased storm surges, salt water intrusion into water aquifers, coastal erosion, and also the increase in temperature. among many other issues. So when we talk about this climate risk, there are some social factors that we should also consider how the Maldivians address climate change and the risk associated with it. There is the long-held cultural beliefs that creates a vicious cycle of climate denialism for many of the locals. For example, there's this proverb in the Maldivian language which says, "Rashege fera vodigia and fera odene," meaning that if one side of the island erodes, then the other side will ascend. So there are these socio-cultural lenses from which people perceive risk. And because of that, there are these maladaptive practices which are undertaken. Now, let's look at the tourism sector. So my research shows that often the business operators see climate change induced risks as a long-term issue. It is not an immediate concern for them. So when it is seen as such, that means there is a lack of proactive action to mitigate and adapt to climate risk. I should also perhaps mention that political inertia and power play at hand as well within the country. There are two different messages sent by the government depending on who is the listener. For instance, at the local level, there is not any much awareness creation of this potential and imminent threat that we are facing. But at the global level, we see our leaders go on forums, talk about the climate-induced risk facing the country. There has been a number of highly mediatized videos about the threats facing the Maldives as well. But at the local level, the messaging is rather reduced and subdued. So when it comes to the grassroots level of action to mitigate and adapt to climate change, what happens is there is that lethargy from the locals as well. When we talk about climate change, I should also come and talk about environmental issues within the country. Now, within the East Asian nations, Maldives has one of the rigorous environmental regulations to develop tourism. But then again, because of that political inertia, there's a poor implementation of these tools. There is a lack of monitoring and also control of these regulations. So linked to that, I would like to discuss three key complex problems that the country is currently facing and which directly informs climate risk for the country. Let's start with aviation to begin with. Aviation, as we all know, is recognized as one of the largest contributors of CO2 emissions. But for international long-haul destinations and also small island destinations, which are geographically isolated, these long-haul destinations, long-haul travel destination is where the tourists are coming from. Aviation does indeed have a high carbon footprint, but what are the other viable methods from which the potential tourists can visit these places? So that becomes a much larger debate as well. So apart from Indian market, that is, all tourism, international tourism markets for the Maldives are from this long-haul travel destination. I mean, here I'm talking about Europe, United States, and Russia. And some developed countries, such as France, has very recently made changes to their legislations. For example, banning short-haul flights to combat aviation emissions. But then when I come and talk about small island countries such as the Maldives, there are no legislation or regulations which address aviation emissions. The second point I would also like to talk about is the dependency and high dependency on fossil fuels to meet the energy demands in the Maldives. Well, there are renewable technologies, there is no policies, knowledge about renewable technologies among local communities, or there's no incentive for tourism businesses to adopt these new technologies. The third and final issue that I would like to also highlight is the waste management issue. Now, waste segregation is not mandated for the local communities, but because of existing environmental regulation on tourism development, there is a very good waste management regulation for the tourism sector. And it is estimated that approximately 25 kilograms of solid waste is generated by a single tourist visiting the country. So you can do the maths and see with 1.7 million tourist arrival, 25 kilograms of solid waste per day, how much of solid waste is being generated. And of course, there are other human-induced activities as well. Most of the waste is taken to a central facility for waste management. But then again, there's inadequate open burning, again, contributing directly to the climate crisis that we are talking about.
Dr. Shaki, I will come back again to talk more about the climate crisis, but thank you for giving us that broad overview, and that was very eye-opening. And now we'll be talking about, well, not the climate crisis, but another set of crises going on. So we'll head over to Sri Lanka. So with now we'll hear from Dr. Samaratunga. So as we all know, Sri Lanka is going through an economic and political crisis as Sri Lanka strives to rejuvenate its tourism sector, which was affected by the COVID-19 pandemic, and now the current economic crisis and looming austerity measures that are in place. Which international player do you feel would emerge as Sri Lanka's greatest ally during this time of need? Dr. Samaratunga, over to you. Thanks.
Yeah. Ayubowan everyone. So thank you very much, Professor Shahid and the team for inviting me to this very important discussion, the webinar. And so there are many things going on in Sri Lanka, especially with respect to the political and the present economic situation. And then the youth basically is protesting in front of the president's secretariat office for about 3 months now, like 80 to 90 consecutive days, and many other professionals and the groups are joining with them and continuously, despite of the different bottlenecks and the harassments they face from different other parties. And when the and we have the Prime Minister newly appointed, because the previous Prime Minister, President Rajapaksa, the former President Rajapaksa resigned, and still we haven't seen any improvement in the country. Still, there are long and like kilometers long queues in front of the sheds, like 2 to 3 kilometers, maybe at some occasions, maybe 4 or 5 kilometers. It's terrible, and the electricity is limited to like well, it's during these busy hours we don't get the electricity, especially during the evenings, and the medicine is going little low, and the food, the inflation for food is about the 50%. If you find it today for 50 rupees and tomorrow it would be about 70 rupees. So that situation is kind of terrible, and it caused much of tension among the general public, and they caused to, you know, different civil disobedience movements are being reported every day all around the country. So it is not very favorable at the moment. So but let's see, and many international players are now joining with us, and I'll come back to it later to support the current situation in Sri Lanka. But when we're sitting back to the COVID-19 situation and what Sri Lanka tourism did during the last 2 years, we must mention that during the COVID-19, especially during the year 2021, we had about 540,000 number of tourists visiting Sri Lanka. 2020 and 2021, we had about 200,000 tourists visiting Sri Lanka, mainly predominantly with the Indian and the Russian, British, and the Ukrainian tourists. And now and during the last few days of last December, or the peak period of Sri Lanka tourism, there was the average arrivals was in between 2,500 to 4,000, which is very healthy. But all of a sudden we faced this economic disaster, and now the tourist arrival has gone down to like couple of hundreds per day and even less than that. And basically the Mahinda Rajapaksa International Airport doesn't receive a single tourist, single flight a day. So it's kind of pathetic. When talking about tourism, so technically the tourism is not happening, and some of the tourists who are coming, especially for the beach destination, okay, they are fine. But if they are planning to engage with the round tours, visiting the sacred sites and the UNESCO World Heritage sites, okay, they're facing the problems because the chauffeurs cannot find the fuel for their vehicles, and still we could not introduce a kind of a good system to provide the petrol or the diesel or the fuel for these tourist vehicles. So it's still, we are questioning the policies and the stand of the government, why we are not paying much attention towards securizing the tourism sector. We can talk more about this during the course of the discussion. So when coming back to the main question, the Sri Lankas, who could be the Sri Lanka's greatest ally? Actually, I have big hopes over China due to many reasons. Number one, since 2010, immediately after the war situation, the Sri Lankan government, the President Rajapaksa's regime, they turned into the east rather than the west, and obtaining huge loans of billions of dollars which we could not afford, and they were given to Sri Lanka at a kind of a higher interest rate. For example, say the Port Hambantota project costed us like 1.3 billion US dollars, and I think the loan was obtained at a rate of like 3%, right? And again, the port city project of Colombo, it costed us like 1.5 billion US dollars, and 500 hectares being filled from the seaside, and 250 land is given back to China, right? And again, there are many other investment projects that took place in Sri Lanka during that last decade, 2010 to 2020, including this the Lotus Tower costed us like 150 million US dollars, but didn't generate a single rupee or single dollar out of that. So people are questioning about this unfocused development, what has happened. So China also has a kind of a responsibility for the present economic crisis, as I feel. So however, we must thank China for providing us some millions of vaccines at a very concessionary rate during this past pandemic situation. And not to mention that they also agreed to provide some essential food items, including the rice, at a concession rate, and some were given as a donation from the people of China to Sri Lanka. So and again, I have a request to make from China, because China has been the #1 tourist market to Sri Lanka since 2014, and they were #1, and thereafter we had #2 India, #3 was from UK. But since the COVID pandemic, China did not send a single tourist to Sri Lanka, but they sent about 200,000 to 300,000 or 350,000 tourists all the time during these last couple of years before the pandemic. But now, even after the pandemic situation, even though Sri Lanka introduced some conducive policies, rules, and regulations to control control and mitigate the spread of the COVID virus, the China still have some concerns over sending to Sri Lanka, which badly affect to the foreign exchange earning to Sri Lanka. So I expect China to stretch their hand towards the securitization of the Sri Lankan economy. That is #1. #2, we are looking at the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank and the Asian Development Bank, because we haven't gone to the IMF loan for a very long time, perhaps about a year or 1.5 decades. Sorry, about 1 decade or 1.5 decades. And of course, they come, the IMF and the ADB and the World Bank loans comes with different conditions, and sometimes it might affects the present government policies. For example, now in Sri Lanka, we provide a lot of concessions, subsidiaries for almost everything, right? So people are kind of dependent because of these unforeseen political movements. Actually, whenever a government is kind of appointed, they give big benefits to the people, so they are not really contributing to the economy, right? A large number of, and again, during the last 2 to 3 years, we could see like hundreds of thousands of people were absorbed into the government sector, and that reduced the production capacity of the people, because in the government sector, basically in Sri Lanka, there's nothing much going on with the production sector. So we need to rethink of restructuring the government employee sector. And so the IMF and the World Bank and the ADB, they might come up with different suggestions how to mitigate this particular issue and how to get a kind of a productive outcome out of the government employees, which is a main concern. And again, we are expecting the IMF and the World Bank to provide us more donations, especially for the health sector, because now it's now many cases being reported all around the country that people are dying out of without having sufficient medicine, and the doctors are waiting hours in the petrol queues, right? Or maybe at some other places to get the gas, right? Because they also have basic needs. So we need good healthcare system. We had a good healthcare system, but now the system has been shattered without having sufficient the medicines. And again, with respect to the education, because of the pandemic situation, 2 years, the Sri Lankans school children, the kids, they were at home for 2 years, and how it affect to their personality development, right? And the early childhood development, so, and the psychological development. And now again, we are running online, so again, we are back at homes, right? And fortunately, I live in the university quarter, so it's a walking distance for me, but most of our colleagues are kind of stranded at their homes. So we have moved online. But again, once we are moving online, we have this electricity issue, right? So the international players need to really look at those things, and the economic reforms are very much important, and the policy reforms are very much important, because we have some other sectors that are affected badly with some bad policies, I would rather say. So that need to be mentioned. And again, I'm looking at India, one of our oldest allies for thousands of years, right? And okay, they have been sending us the tourists, and they have been giving the needed support. Now I think we used all the Indian credit line to purchase the diesel, to purchase the petrol, and it was like $2 billion, 1.5 billion or $2 billion. They have been supporting, but okay, now if Sri Lanka fails, the entrance to India is basically the Indian Ocean. So the security of the Indian Ocean will be at a vulnerable position. It not only affect the India, but also the bordering countries like Bhutan, like Pakistan, like Maldives. So the securitization of the Indian Oceans is very...
Dr. Samaratunga, thank you, for giving us that overview and linking geopolitics. So since you actually talked about India, now we'll have to move over to Nepal because there is the Bay of Bengal Initiative for Multi-Sectoral Technical and Economic Cooperation, or the BIMSTEC, which is going on, this initiative. And it has emphasized the importance of intra-regional tourism to bring about long-term economic growth. So, Mr. Pant, since you have been studying this for quite some time, how would you evaluate the significance of religious tourism, specifically for India, in the broader foreign policy goals of Nepal? So, Mr. Pant, if you're there, over to you now.
Thank you so much, Dr. Shahid, and for providing me an opportunity to speak on the topic. And thank you so much for Dr. Manoj and Dr. Shakila for your highlighting insight. So I would like to start with the history of Nepal's tourism sector, and then I will jump into the international relations. So it was 1949 when Annapurna base camp, expedition on Annapurna started, followed by 1953 Everest Base Camp, led by Tenzing Norgay and Edmund Hillary. And then 1960, we have a travel association, establishment of travel association in Nepal. And in 1972, we had a travel master plan, tourism master plan, followed by 1978, Foreign and Tourism Ministry in Nepal. And in 1990, we have a concept of addressing tourism as a tool to mitigate poverty alleviation and to address social inequality in Nepal. And in early 2001, 2006, we are hit by the civil war, like in Sri Lanka. And then 2006, we have a peace treaty with Maoist, and then settlement came down, and there's a rise of tourism in Nepal. And in 2008 and 2009, we again hit by the global recession. And 2010, we started. In 2011, we have a Nepal tourism year. And then we went to like 2020, we had a big disaster. That's a COVID-19 pandemic. It's a global pandemic, affected everyone. So I want to address that from 1949 to 1990 and 1990 to 2020. So our transformation of tourism is that before it was for a personal purpose. From 1990s, it came into the policies. And now from 1990 to 2020, so tourism has been regarded as a tool to mitigate foreign currency imbalance. So government is now promoting tourism to get investment, to get branding of the country, and also to balance foreign currency reserve. Because the last 20 years, our migration, our quantum leap to world has increased so much that the consumerism behavior is increased so much that our exchange of dollar has been decreased. So we are also in the same situation of Sri Lanka. So though we have like 6 months reserve for foreign currency, but we are also in a similar situation. So this time, the tourism sector is also regarded as a very important sector, apart from our Gulf migration. So where we get remittance in terms of working there. So, and then, so I would like to link that. So we are like multiple initiatives to promote a cultural tourism in Nepal, and especially we talk about cultural tourism in Nepal. It's with India. Basically with India or Sri Lanka and Maldives, and they're in a limited space because both countries, India is 1.25 billion populations and Nepal is around 30 million populations. Most of the Indian Nepali population are dominated by Hindus, and we have like cultural, economical, political, and historical ties with India. So for Nepal-India people's intimacy, so there are many channels of exchange. So BIMSTEC is one of the examples. So he talks about the Buddha circuit, which overall connecting with Buddhists and Hindus in a circular pattern. So basically, Buddha was born in Lumbini. He got enlightened in Bihar, and then he moved to Uttar Pradesh for serious teaching. So last time we had Narendra Modi in Nepal to observe the Buddha Jayanti in Nepal, to Buddha's festival, and a few days ago, let's say 2 weeks ago. And he landed in Lumbini, and there were multiple partnerships with Nepal and India in terms of flourishing the area, Lumbini and Buddhism in Nepal. So we had also like a new airport there, international airport in Gautam International Airport, which also tends to be the potential component to expand our religious tourism between India and Nepal and abroad also, even Japanese or Thailand. That's the thing. So talking about like foreign policy thing. So especially if you talk about in Nepal, we have Chinese in the northern side and Indian in the southern side. We are surrounded by three-side India. So India is inevitable partner. So to balance foreign policy, there are different dimensions of balancing foreign policy, and geopolitics is very much powerful in Nepal. So tourism comes in a very small section. So tilting with or moving with India or moving with China doesn't affect the relationship between two countries. So it's in fact that Nepal's geography and Nepal's economic and its cultural ties with India definitely India has a bargaining power in Nepal. And I will share a very interesting thing, a Western narrative in Nepal these days. So in 1950s, so Nepal is regarded as the frontier state in between India and China. Then in 1970s, this is the narration given by the Western scholar. In 1970s, it is a buffer state. And 1990 is a landlocked state. And early 2000 to till now, to 2010, 18 or 19, it's like a land linked. We talk about the interconnectivity with the broader Himalayas region. And recently, the General Flynn, the commander of Indo-Pacific commander, came to Nepal, and he shared that Nepal is now a land power. So in the past 60 years, the direction of Nepal is being changed. And that also ultimately links with the tourism also. And Nepal is also one of the best place in geopolitical sense for a best place for army drilling in high altitude thing. So India, Nepal, or India, US, or India, China are doing there, Nepal are doing there, because if you have to fight for if you have to fight in a high altitude sector, in high altitude terrain, like in India or in the Tibet region, so the drilling in Nepal higher altitude matters a lot. So in that sense, also the partnership is going on. And next thing is I want to say that so there are big challenges, environmental challenges in Nepal. So tourists come to Nepal. So the management sector, I want to say that the tourism sector is formal sector in Nepal, but the working people in tourism are semi-formal. They are from a porter to homestay owner to a multinational to a business company. So it's a semi-registered, semi-formal sector. So the effort has been going on to make it whole formalized. But things that the grassroots people doesn't want to get registered. There are different factors, because when you get registered, there's a perceived thought that we need to pay a tax, and my income is very low, and while paying for the tax, my income get decreased. So there's some sort of lapses there. The government need to work on that. And the next thing is that, so during pandemic, so talking about the pandemic, so we had like a very record low revenue in comparing to around like 4.5 decades, and we had like 40,000 tourists came to Nepal in last March. So significant increase in our tourism sector. Although there are many things need to be done. So government has funded around 72 firms, tourism firms, for refinancing loans, which is around 8.9 billion Nepalese rupees. And even Western, like UNDP, United Nations Development Program, or like USAID, they're also helping to empower the pro bono or grassroots people to elevate poverty. So these are also efforts going on. So currently we are guided by, yeah, sure.
Yeah, if you want to complete, and then
yeah, sure.
Just saying that thank you for giving it. Yes.
I'm closing my statement.
Yes.
We are guided by two policies now: Nepal Tourism Policies 2008, National Cultural Policies 2011, and National Aviation Policy 2008. So these are three policies we are guiding the tourism sector in Nepal. So thanks. I will continue in the next session. Thank you so much. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I wish we had more time for this round, but of course we'll come back to all of you. So thank you for giving us that overview on Nepal, and some of it actually sounds very promising. Some of the measures that the government is taking over there. And for that, now we will move on to another Himalayan country, Bhutan. And Mr. Rinzin, Bhutan has as we know, has a high value, low volume tourism policy. In the post-COVID-19 world, does the team at the Tourism Council of Bhutan, which you're part of, do you all feel that it is adequate, this policy that you have, or is there a need to create a new brand Bhutan in future tourism policy? So over to you now, Mr. Rinzin. Thank you.
Thank you. So a very good evening from Thimphu, Bhutan, the capital city of Bhutan. My name is Namcho again. I'd like to thank Atlantic Council for giving us this opportunity, giving me this opportunity to talk to, share about tourism with my distinguished colleagues from Maldives, of course, Nepal, and Sri Lanka. So yes, I think I need to probably give you a brief history of this high value, low volume tourism policy, which started during the coronation of our fourth king, Jigme Sengye Wangchu's Majesty, the King Jigme Sengye Wangchu, in 1974. So when we first started in 1974, we had the option to really open like any other country where a tourist can go there and get a visa on arrival, or just process visa and don't have to have bookings, or don't even have to route through a tour operator. So in 1974, the wisdom was to have high value, low volume tourism. So with that, it was initially started by the government, and then later tour operators were mandated as a mandatory requirement. Tourists were mandated to use a service of a tour operator, and under that system, everybody had to be all tourists coming to Bhutan had to pay a prepackaged agreed sum of 250 for autumn and spring, and 200 for winter and summer. So that is inclusive of hotel, 3-star minimum, a guide, a transportation, and meals. So that was the kind of system that the government organized. So not anybody could not just walk into a border and then come in as a tourist, So that was a system. So it was designed to give a high value experience to tourists, attract mindful and responsible tourists, which would actually again be very will bring positive benefits to places that he or she travels. So this high value, low volume was designed to give visitors a very immersive experience, and then also not so much of the negative impact that they will bring to the destination. Obviously, of course, 1974 Bhutan was very, I would say, a poor country, and we needed money. But the wisdom then was really not to overdo tourism. And still today, Bhutan is not really looking to overdo tourism. And I just wanted to share, I think you talk about a bit on impact on COVID. Of course, we are grateful to, of course, our king for really looking after everyone in the tourism industry and beyond up until now. And we are really looking at how do we ensure that moving forward, that we open tourism. And now I think this is a very interesting question, and Doctor, I think it looks like you all read the minds of people in tourism industry in Bhutan of what we are trying to do, as to asking the question about, is high value low volume still relevant? Do we need rebranding? And that is where I think a lot of things are at the moment of how do we go forward. But I think it remains, the answer is that we feel that the high value, low volume, the wisdom that we had in 1974, we have not lived up to this. Bhutan 2019, pre-COVID, we had a little over 300,000. A lot of it was from India. And we felt it was overdone in terms of number of tourism. If we share the revenue and numbers, we are way closer to Maldives, Sri Lanka, or Nepal. We are a very small number, and yet we felt that the number was quite big for a small country. And we are, I think, by size, of course, by the structure of the landscape, we have very small valleys that people could accommodate. So it's under the high value, low volume policy. It's also important that our own people are not what do you call it, don't suffer in terms of when tourists come in and visit their places. So as we move on and as we prepare to have a regular tourism post-COVID, we are of course thinking that is high value, low volume a way to go? Or the other question that we're asking is, did we live up to this wisdom that we had initiated in 1974, where there was a very managed system? So moving forward, I think we're looking at maybe also rebranding, but strengthening this high value, low volume tourism, and making sure that we get good. We get a good number of people, and also upskill people who are in the industry. So pre-COVID, we probably may not, we have not managed to actually give a good skilling program and specialization in tourism industry. But moving forward, we're looking at now, because if you really want to strengthen and grow as a high value destination, we need good people in the industry who are knowledgeable, who are skilled, and who are paid well. So gainful employment is something that we are really looking at. So to answer this question about this high value, low volume, are we looking to change it, or we look to rebrand? High value, low volume, I think we have not lived up to the promise that was actually given to us 1974. Now I think we're looking at restructuring ourselves to strengthen this high value, low volume. And rebranding, Happiness is a brand that we have been all along for a couple of years we've been saying, but I think we may look at the national brand Happiness. Of course, Grosh National Happiness is popularly known globally, coming from Bhutan. But so rebranding, probably yes, but in terms of high value, low volume, we are looking to strengthen this in terms of how we structure ourselves and get the maximum value out of tourism. So Doctor, I want to stop here and maybe move on to maybe the other sessions. So thank you. This is an opening some topics about tourism in Bhutan. So thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Rinzin, and thank you for joining us from the Tourism Council of Bhutan. And thank you to all our panelists, of course, for giving us, that overview. And we're very happy about that, because now we can move on to our broader discussion, where we'll cover a few themes, including sustainable tourism management, protecting vulnerable groups, and other wider regional cooperation and diversification issues. So first, we'll go to Mr. Samaratunga, and it appears that tourists from Russia and Ukraine were two major groups visiting Sri Lanka. Now that tourism from these countries, well, it's probably not happening as it used to be, and it appears that the island nation will take some time to bounce back to its feet after the economic crisis. What kind of approach should the tourism operators and the wider institutions affiliated with tourism take to convince people to visit Sri Lanka? So over to you now, Dr. Samaratunga.
Thank you, Dr. Rudabesh. And right. And sorry, during my previous discussion, I moved into the geopolitics because, well, when we are talking about the Sri Lanka and the present crisis, of course, we cannot move away. Now, back to the geopolitics, the Russia and the Ukraine. The unfortunate incident has again crippled down the tourism sector, because Russia has been the third tourist generator of Sri Lanka, and the Ukraine was like seventh tourist generator during the last year. So now all of a sudden the things again started settling down. And during the period when no one else sent us the tourists, the Russia and the Ukraine continued to send us the tourists during through a special channel that both government agreed upon. So now that they have broken into the war, and we have again some hundreds of Ukrainian tourists stranded here in Sri Lanka without being able to go back home. So with such situations, the many of our vulnerable sectors have, they are out of the fire from the frying pan, right? Especially the women, and again the disabled people, and again so the people from the rural areas who are depending on the tourism sector. Now they are badly suffering. And again, not to mention that Russia is one of our main tea buyers, right? They were like our second tea importer internationally. So now the tea purchases has also gone down, and the tea industry has also shuttered. So all these kinds of situations are there. So now we need to look at securitization of the vulnerable sector, and especially the women and the rural communities who are totally dependent on the tourism industry. Actually, in Sri Lanka, like, there are hundreds of villages, and there are many towns and the cities, those who are totally depending on the tourism. Like, say, I live in Anuradhapura, one of the UNESCO World Heritage Sites, and 20% of this big city is depending, 20% of the population depending on the tourism sector. And like 40 kilometers away from my place is Habarana. It's like 75% of its economy was depending on the tourism sector, and now they have no way out to go. And during the last months, we had the random visits from the Russians and the Ukrainians, but for the safari jeeps and to engage with the wildlife and the nature trails and everything, because we have like 5 national parks in that particular region. But now all the guest houses been closed, and the safari jeeps are available in the sale yards, right? So when we will bounce back, but when we are bouncing back, I don't know how many suppliers will remain in the tourism sector. So when talking about the approaches that we need to implement right away is securitization of the suppliers and the overall tourism value chain. Tourism does not mean only the airlines. It is not only the cruise lines. It's not only the big players of the blue chip companies, and the communities are highly linked with the tourism industry. And now in Sri Lanka, according to the before the pandemic, we had about 500,000 direct and indirect employees joined with the tourism sector. 500,000 in the sense, you can imagine like 2 million population, right? 2 million population of the country. Now, what happened to them? Where are they now? Are burning questions, because most of them have left the industry, and most of the skilled the employees have left the country, right? The Western towards migration, and again, I'm sure Professor Dr. Aishat also see many of the Sri Lankan employees there in the Maldives, right? And they are again in Australia's and the Western countries. It is also there. So we need to make sure to establish a channel that pump money into the local communities. So the best recommendation that I have been proposing during the last 2 years, even to the tourism ministry and the higher authority, is the alternative tourism. So we need to look at a community-based and a community-centered approach during this new normal era, right? We got the Ukrainians, we got the Russians, but that was again for the beach tourism or the part of the mass tourism movements. But if we need to send the money to the people who really need the money, we need to look at the community-centric approaches. We need to promote the alternative tourism. We need to promote agro-tourism. We need to promote the marine tourism. We need to promote the birdwatching tourism. And we need to look at all these different sorts of rural tourism, where the community can actively participate from the planning approach, planning stage to the implementation stage. And of course, the government and the INGO sector and even the universities can facilitate, can provide needed consultation to establish a good mechanism on which grounds this tourism can run. That need to be done immediately before promoting Sri Lanka further. I have bad experience because many of my friends are working with the tour operators and the travel agencies, and sometimes the tourists are coming, right? But upon arrival, they identify that, okay, there's no fuel to run. So before inviting the tourists back to Sri Lanka, despite of this economic crisis, we need to secure the supply chain, right? Once it is secured only, we need to invite the tourists back. Otherwise, we cannot put them in trouble. The tourists, they are here to enjoy their vacation, right? So that securitization should be there. And the promotions, when it comes to the promotion, we need to look at actually to a certain extent. Now we are not totally into Mr. Damcho's high value, low volume thing, right? We have a larger number of people depending on it, but considering the present dearth situation, I think we need to develop a separate aligned market as Bhutan is doing. We have the pristine, the well-heritage sites and the natural sites, right? And all the forests and wildlife, flora, cultural and heritage sites. We need to look at a way to bring down some big volumes of dollars, right? Instead of hundreds of dollars, we need to identify a way to get the attention of the rich and allied travelers to Sri Lanka, because then whatever the limited resources can be allocated to them, right? Thereby, we can increase the multiply effect of the Sri Lankan communities, and whoever comes should be sent to the communities, give the community experience, engage with the community activities, and thereby we can employ the communities there. So alternative tourism is what we should be looking at here in Sri Lanka during the period of crisis.
Thank you so much, Dr. Samaratunga. And of course, geopolitics is always linked to it, but we are trying to, keep the discussion very focused on tourism. And thank you for that. And of course, as you mentioned, neighboring Maldives, and Dr. Shakila, you are an expert on tourism in this region, and especially the Maldives. We wanted to know that I actually went there twice, and the last time was in January, and a big portion of tourists are from Ukraine and Russia. Now there's a war going on, and probably tourism numbers from those countries have decreased. So how do we increase, the a number of tourists coming from other countries? So there are a lot of tourists coming from from Europe, from India, of course, from China. But how do we look at other destinations? Tourists coming from other countries to Maldives, considering Maldives as a destination. So over to you now, Dr. Shakila.
Just a slight correction there. Even I perceive that because there is an ongoing war between Russia and Ukraine, there will be a significant dip in tourism arrivals from those two countries. And because I was given this talk, I looked up the tourism statistics today, and surprise, surprise. In 2019, Russia was ranked number 6 for the Maldives. And as of today, it is ranked number 3rd. And looking at Ukraine, before it was considered an emerging market, today it is, the country has 2% tourism share for the Maldives. So fascinating to find that. Maybe there are high affluent travelers within these two markets. And we have seen high spending in affluent travelers using the Maldives during the COVID lockdown as well, as work from home hubs or ISO hubs. Maldives does play the number game a lot. So they do chase the mantra of growth is good, unlike our colleague from Bhutan here. So which market should we chase is perhaps not the question I would ask. I would be framing, how do we maximize tourism benefits for the local communities from the existing arrivals? We have seen the number of days tourists are staying in the country decline over the years. Previously, it could be up to 10 days minimum, but now we are seeing 6 days. Hotel industry already applies this method of minimum stay requirements in specific hotels that could potentially be applied for these countries like the Maldives. And I see 2 benefits from that. One is we are talking about climate change induced impacts. So if you have somebody coming from a long haul destination such as Russia and Ukraine, and if there is a policy stating or the minimum requirement for stay in the country is 10, that means there would be less aviation, hopefully, so less emissions occurring. The second one is, unless somebody is coming for an all-inclusive resort, then that means the longer they stay in the country, the spending would be more. So there's more economic revenue generated. So that's my thought on that.
Thank you, Dr. Shakila. And that's very interesting that the numbers from Russia have actually gone up during this situation. Yeah, it probably shows that Maldives being maybe a higher end destination, maybe as you've also pointed out, richer tourists are coming in. And thank you for pointing out that perhaps maybe the days, should be longer for each tourist arrivals, certain benefits arriving to certain communities. And we'll come over to that. Of course, we'll come back to you. But at this point, we want to go to Mr. Pant, because we want to talk about diversification of tourism in Nepal. And I've been to Nepal once, and it's not wrong to say the vast majority of tourists are from India and other South Asian countries, neighboring South Asian countries like Bangladesh. Of course, there are Western tourists as well, but how do we tap into other markets? Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Shahid, for your question. So talking about diversification in Nepal, that's true that we have tourists coming from India, mostly from India, and then China, and comparing to South Asia. Very few Western tourists coming from UK, or United States, or Eastern Europe. So I have seen, so diversification is very necessary if you take an example of Saudi Arabia, the Mohammed bin Salman is diversifying its country from the oil-based economy to a tourism-based economy or a digital economy or to a IT or information technology. So we have the news are coming there, the Saudi Vision 2030 to develop hundreds of thousands of hotels near the Red Sea. So this is the thing. The diversification is very necessary, especially at a time of crisis. So when or in a very difficult situation. So only one side dependency always puts us in a trouble. So I have seen a few challenges for our diversity in Nepal. So first challenge, I see the connectivity of the aviation industry. So for example, if a guy wants to come to Nepal or a couple wants to come to Nepal via United States, so it is easy by Qatar Airways. You get a flight from Washington to Doha and then Kathmandu, and the ticket price is very high because due to connectivity. So we have limitation in connecting with Western markets. We have Nepal Airlines, which is a very fragile airlines nowadays. So there's a debate going on whether to privatize these airlines or not. Likewise, in India, Indian government formally gave to Tata India. So the similar issue is going on. So connectivity is very low, and the ticket price around ticket price cost around $100,000, $1,000 or $1,020 for two-way trip. That's expensive. And in $1,020, you can spend 1 week or more than days in Nepal. So the first thing I challenge is connectivity. And second is that we lack in the branding of our country. So Nepal is very blessed enough to have a tourist from 1950s to till now, with a very limited branding. So it was initially contributed by the Swiss and French, especially a Swiss geographer, Tony Hagen, who supported Nepal's hiking or trekking trail. So that's from the Swiss or French branding. So it's still going on in Nepal. So social media presence is very low in Nepal. If you see the homestay to a high-powered travel agency in Nepal, so their comparatively is very vast difference. So most of the people in Nepal in grassroots still they don't use digital media. So though young people are coming into that industry, homestay, they are started using, but the connectivity is very low in terms of digital market also. And the next thing is I identified that embassies presence in we have like 30 embassies around the world in most of the countries, in most of the power center of the countries. But our embassy's role in doing economic diplomacy or tourism diplomacy is very limited. So we have like hardly few stall for tourism stall in a 6 month around or in a year, hardly in a year to dispatch our duty or our product. And next thing is that in Nepal, there's always debate between the private sector and the public sector. So who is responsible for tourism development in Nepal, whether it's sole government or it's a public-private partnership. So most of the in high hills in Nepal, high altitude in Nepal, the tourism sector is handled by several Sherpas communities who are traditionally efficient or they have ethnic knowledge of handling the hospitality industry. But if you come to city areas or urban areas, the education like the hotel management training or hotel management education have changed that pattern. So there's always debate going on because we have also like a very fragile government. So the change of government happens within a year or 2 years. So from the ministerial level to the local level, the inter-agencies coordination is very low. That also hampers our diversifications mechanism. And next thing is that our limitations in Nepal also, though it's tourists coming only from Nepal, from India or Southeastern countries, and also if you talk within Nepal, so our product has been limited since 1960s. So we always sell our tourism product like Everest Base Camp or the Mount Everest and the Entrepreneur Base Camp. But we hardly wants to promote the other unexplored areas in Nepal, that with the western part of Nepal or the eastern part of Nepal or in Tarai, where we have like a growing urbanizations, we can also create irrigation facilities there. So these are the things going on. And Nepal has a potential to become like a diplomatic or business center also, because we know that the global power center is in India and China, is coming to India and China. And according to some reports, by 2050, the economic center will be in around Himalayas. So it has a potential to become a new Geneva, or like any towns in Nepal can be potential to become new Geneva, like diplomatic center or business center. So government has that potential also. But we have been lacking the diversity patterns, and we have seen during lockdown also, that India Nepal doesn't need any visa system, or there is no any some sort of formalized system for passing of people. So, and another is that we don't have a policy like in Bhutan. They have a policy of high value tourists. In Nepal, we don't have such policies. We welcome high value also, low value also. And you remember, Nepal used to be the hippie trail, the most fascinating place for hippies in 1970s. So for all the Volkswagen car, all the gazas or the hashish used to be there, that attraction of Nepal in 1970s. So very mismatched thing also there. So that's all from there. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Pant. So yes, now that we've talked about tourism diversification, we have to talk about some of the things that are probably not as pleasant. So Dr. Shakila, there are reports that the COVID-19 pandemic has exposed some of the abuse of migrant workers in the Maldives, many of whom work in the tourism industry. What kind of framework should we create for growing a sustainable tourism economy that protects laborers, including migrant workers? Thank you.
That's a great question, I must say. When we talk about the expatriate employment force, we are looking at roughly 180,000 expatriates working within the Maldives, and largely in construction and second in tourism. Mostly they are from Bangladesh, India, Nepal, and also currently some from China as well. So when the COVID pandemic occurred, there is, some of the reports have highlighted, there were a lot of redundancies made. When the tourism industry came to a halt, a lot of industry operators said they could no longer afford to keep the employees, which was the wrong thing to do, just to let them go like that. But this also highlighted, the COVID pandemic also highlighted a very dark side of expatriate employment in the country, as well as how locals are employed within the country. So this provided an opportunity for the government to change, bring some changes to the employment regulations. So for example, the government overhauled the expatriate employment regulations, removed the previously very insulated department, expatriate employment office, and brought it under the Ministry of Economics. Previously, it was not mandated for the tourism operators or business operators to provide health insurance for the expatriates. Now it's mandated. Back in 2008, there was what was that regulation? Employment regulation, which was submitted to the parliament, and it was sitting there up until now. But because of the pandemic, government understood how vulnerable everybody was, both the local communities and the expatriates. When the tourism operators shut their doors, the locals were able to fly or go to their home islands. The same was not possible for the expatriates who were just left to fend for themselves. So some NGOs and local communities, they got together and they did support the expatriates, such as through providing free legal guidance and also meals and so on and so forth. But the government was a bit reactionary at the first instance, I should say. And what they did was they were looking at immediate changes and also making the economy more resilient. So although not a perfect system, the government set up a financial relief system for the business operators. The only requirement was that they pledge not to lay off the employees. That was the only stipulation. And you know, when there is no monitoring or rigorous control of this, what would happen in this scenario? So that was not the ideal thing that should have happened. But again, as I said earlier, this did provide the opportunity to bring those changes. So the Employment Act has been enacted January this year, and that has paved minimum wages for the locals. This did not cover the expatriate employment workforce, which means based on the minimum wages, and there are 3 different categories of payment depending on the size of the business. This means the business operator can now employ an expatriate with a lower salary or wage for the same job rather than employ a local, because they have to pay higher or the minimum wages. So that is not an ideal scenario, considering that there is a lot of foreign leakages already occurring within the country. And there's more than 8% of local unemployment in the country as well. So there's a lot of space here to improve the expatriate work conditions, so they could also have a decent and dignified working environment. To begin with, let's talk about how they are living in. So there are lots of groups of people living in smaller spaces. So regulations need to be brought in and enacted, regulating shared accommodation. Employees should not be giving their passports to the employer. And also there are other things like the minimum wage regulation that I'm talking about that should also cover the expatriate workforce. So that's my thought on that point.
Okay, then. Of course, as in all sectors, there are certain unpleasant parts of it. And in the Maldives, we see that with the migrant workers. In Nepal, Mr. Pant, we have read about, well, I have read about the vulnerability of women in the tourism sector, largely because they compose a big percentage of the labor force in that sector. So according to you, what kind of strategies can the government of Nepal adopt to revive, of course, the tourism sector, but benefit vulnerable communities such as, women who are employed in this sector? Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Shahid, for your question. So I would like to start this with a project called Tourism for Rural Poverty Alleviation Program in TRPA in 2001-2005. It was funded by UNDP and with support of SNB, the Netherlands. So basically the objective of this program was to empower the rural community who lives in high altitude to the Terai region. This project was basically targeted in the Dolpa, in high altitude mountains, and to the Terai of region, to Chitwan. So empowering the pre-Buddhist community to the Tharo communities of Nepal. So there are like multiple projects funded by international development agencies going on to empower the grassroots level in terms of supporting homestay, or in terms of providing seed grants to the community, and also like medicinal support. For example, we have like a climate change support program, which gives seeds or any crops to the people who are affected by the climate change. And in this issue, the vulnerability, there's a dimension of like climate change also in Nepal. If you go to the Mustang and or Dolpa, the climate change has drastically changed in the last 6 years. So the community are forced to move from their original place to the city areas. So the city also becoming more crowded due to the climate change and it's basically affecting the vulnerable community. So to understand the nexus, let's take an example. Any community, any rural community or anything community living in a high altitude Dolpa or Humla, due to the effect of climate change, they come to the city areas, let's say in the Terai region. And cities' lifestyle is very different. They need a skill or they need knowledge for a living. So they have a different pattern of life there. So there's a chance of getting into risks of vulnerability or chance of getting into the risks of threats, and especially women. So women are generally employed in a hotel sector. Let's take an example of Pokhara or Kathmandu. Most of the women are employed in the hotel sector. Though women who are hotel owner or a homestay owner, there's a very different limited chances of getting exploited by the owner. But if you talk about the labor or the worker who is informal, doesn't have a contract with the owner, so there's a high chance of getting exploited. And that those women who are illiterate also, they don't have a capacity or knowledge to go and report into the police, or they don't know the labor rights or any sort of things. They are also not under the social security program, or their owner doesn't provide such environment for them. So for this, I think the legal and mechanisms should be very strong. And though there are organizations working on the women who works in the hotel field, hotel or hospitality industry. So there are like alliance of organizations like the tourism entrepreneurs women issues in that situation in Pokhara, that supports women, give trainings to the women to empower them, also raise their issues if they are exploited or abused or sexually abused. So they also fight their legal cases. So these are the things. But and also the thing is that there is also issue of resettlement, because there's also chance of flood or drought in the area, which is also evaporating the rural community. So government has now has to address very multiple fronts. And it needs to protect the woman also. It needs to protect the urban high altitude areas from the climate change. So till now the government strategy has been very limited in a consultation meeting, or only for expanding or only for facilitating or raising tax from the private sector or tourism sector. So government has have overlooked such vulnerability index. So these areas has been supported by the NGOs or non-profit organizations comparing to government. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Pant. And that's also good to know that there are certain, framework in place to support women and other vulnerable groups. So, Mr. Rinzin, now I move over to Bhutan, of course, and you've been sitting patiently for quite some time. So, recently, last month, in fact, we had the Bhutanese Prime Minister, Dr. Lote Sering, join us and here at the South Asia Center. And His Excellency described a tension in elected officials between the short-term pressure to stay in office and long-term holistic vision for Bhutan, of course. So, of course, that's not always limited to Bhutan, that's for many other countries. But in the context of Bhutan, we wanted to know to what extent does the tension between maintaining Bhutan's COVID-19 strategy and popular desire for short-term economic growth influence the tourism councils of Bhutan's approach to cultivating a sustainable tourism sector. Thank you.
Excuse me, I forgot to unmute myself. Thank you, Doctor. Of course, our Prime Minister, Dr. Lote Sering, is a fantastic Prime Minister. And I have a great faith in him that he would steer Bhutan to the right direction and not fall prey to the short-term gains. So in the context of, I think, like you had mentioned, I think it's not just Bhutan. I think it's anywhere in the world. Of course, individual interests, business interest. So they probably would want things to happen immediately and more so to make money. And they have and right so, because COVID had actually impacted a lot of us and some countries very severely. And like I said earlier, we are grateful to His Majesty King for looking after us during COVID, and some countries are not fortunate like us. So their pressure is there to open as soon as possible and relax COVID protocol as soon as possible, just to be normal like before. But in the context of Bhutan's tourism policy, I think this is slightly different. Dr. Shakila mentioned of maximizing profit. So for us, I think it's beyond just maximizing profit. For us, we need money. Of course, all countries need money. We need money, but we need the right kind of people to come in and the right size of tourism in Bhutan. Tourism for us is very important. and for many reasons, survival, culture, sovereignty. So it's very important for us, and also to move forward as a very sustainable country. And when we talk about tourism for Bhutan, and when you talk about this short-term gains, we always bring in the elements of what do we leave for our future generation. And the whole restructuring of tourism in Bhutan, I think it's geared towards what is that we want to keep for our future generations, and how are we going to look after our present youth, including women. I think we talked a bit on women earlier. What kind of opportunities are we giving? Is the tourism by opening without any restrictions falling prey to unnecessary future problems? Have we seen pre-COVID some of these problems arising? And yes, we have seen some problems arising. There is sometimes in some places entirely change of landscape geared towards tourism, hotels everywhere, and souvenir shops everywhere. So these kind of things are actually not sustainable for Bhutan. The ultimate goal of high value of tourism for Bhutan is really looking at how can we have the right kind of people come to Bhutan. Because when you have the right kind of people coming to Bhutan, they are happy, and the Bhutanese people will respect tourism, people who come here. So that is a challenge for us. And so when we discuss this context of having the right kind of tourism in Bhutan, also we have to be mindful, like I mentioned earlier, that COVID impact from COVID to people, especially in businesses. They want to see tourism open as soon as possible without any restrictions. So that is, of course, what probably was meant by our Prime Minister, our Prime Minister, Dr. Lote Sering. So yes, there is going to be pressure like that, of course, to not just for Bhutan, for any other country, and for that matter, also to an agency like my office. My office is a national tourism office, equivalent to a ministry in other countries, and we get pressure, or we have people in the industry. They want to see tourism opened as soon as possible. But what we try and say is the kind of mistakes that we make when we say tourism. When you talk about tourism, we say, who are the stakeholders of tourism? We say, okay, the tour operators, the hoteliers, the guides, the restaurants. But we try and forget that every citizen of Bhutan is a stakeholder of tourism. That is something that actually we have really, we're trying to understand ourselves of. When we think about tourism, we think about Bhutan. Tourism must serve Bhutan, and Bhutan, no, it's not other way. Bhutan cannot serve Bhutan. It just cannot be the other way around. Tourism must serve Bhutan, and that's how the approach has to be. So when we talk about, again, I keep on stressing the short-term gains. We have to make sure that our people, like our Prime Minister, his responsibility to ensure that Bhutan doesn't fall prey to the short-term gains. Of course, it's important as a Prime Minister that he has to look after the benefit of people, ensure that there is good amount of business, there's the tourism business, but not to forget the long-term goals of the country, and how can we be different? Are we looking at just numbers and ignoring the social or environmental impacts that tourism will generate? Or are we looking at, can we have a different model where we have the right people, and then there's less environment impact, and there's less social or no social or negative social or environment impact? So we need, I must admit, we need money. Bhutan needs money, of course. Money is important for us, but also we also need our survival, sustainability. Moving forward as a nation that would really, we feel as a Bhutanese, we feel proud of staying in Bhutan, happy about Bhutan, not getting overridden by people coming as tourists. And at the same time, tourists feel special when they come to Bhutan. They are our guests. So how do we make sure that this is actually achieved, not falling prey to the short-term gain? So there is, of course, a pressure, because like I said, businesses would like to make money. They have the right, because they got into business to make money, and the government has allowed them to get into business. So we have to make sure that, I think, these are all taken care. I mean, when we actually discuss about long-term sustainability, not everybody would win. I think some people already probably lose, but for the benefit of the longer term of the goal. So there are a lot of interesting things happening post-COVID. People are looking at when will Bhutan open, just like pre-COVID. How are we going to open? But at the same time, the government is mindful that we try and achieve, strengthen, and get back ourselves on track of how we have started. What was the wisdom in 1974? So this is happening at the moment. So obviously, he's gonna. Our Prime Minister must probably have also felt the pressure for the short-term gains. But I have great faith in him that he actually steer Bhutan to the right direction. So that's a bit on, I think, Bhutan, and of course the short-term gains, and how probably look forward in terms of moving forward. So Doctor, thank you.
So thank you, Mr. Rinzin. Actually, we thoroughly enjoyed Dr. Sering's interview, and such a wonderful and inspiring leader that you have. So I actually have a follow-up question about Bhutan. So, Bhutan is a country in South Asia which completely closed off its doors to foreign visitors for 2 years. And personally, I was also thinking when I can go visit Bhutan next. I've been there back in 2018. So I was wondering, I mean, what kind of professions did people involved in the tourism industry take up as they had to probably leave the industry during this time? And do you feel that as you're opening up, there is enough of an incentive for these people to rejoin the sector as the country opens its doors to international tourists? Thank you.
Thank you, Doctor. It's a very important question. I think it's a very important question. And one of the things probably I am really happy to share with you is the program that was initiated by, again, our king, called the Sup's Garden of Peace. So yes, we closed down for 2 years, and these people who were trained to protect us during the COVID play an instrumental role. So initially we started with zero COVID policy. So when there's 1 or 2 COVID cases, we went down to lockdowns, and it was quite a challenging thing for us. But lives over livelihood was a policy that we actually taken. So lives are important. As long as you can stay alive, livelihood would come. So that was the approach that the government has taken for over 2 years. And while we had taken this approach, it was difficult for us. Of course, there was no businesses, but this the SUPs, the Garden of Peace, the Peacekeeper Peace, they actually ensured that people are actually well taken care. So food delivery of food essentials is actually done well. And then now coming back to your question about now people who actually during COVID may not be doing business, they didn't do tourism business. Some did, of course, local tourism, domestic tourism. And I must say that COVID in other way was also a blessing. So those people who actually, some of them who were in tourism for a very long time, they actually tried something else, like farming, for example. And I know one of my colleagues who were in tourism industry, a lot of farming now. I think the diversification, COVID taught us a lot of things to save money of all. That something like this is going to come, you need to save money. So they taught us to save money, and at the same time they taught us to diversify. So I'm not sure if some of them will come back to tourism, because I think they know now that tourism is actually a very vulnerable industry, highly volatile industry, and very dependent to other factors. So some of them may not come back. But so this has happened during COVID. Good things have happened during COVID, and of course some people have struggled. But yeah, some people have actually taken new initiatives, and probably they will not come back. But people who are coming back to tourism, now we must ensure that this high value is being guaranteed. I mean, when we say high value, a lot of people think that high value is equated to staying in a 5-star hotel. I mean, like going with maybe a bigger tour operator that has all the fleet of cars. High value for us is this immersive, special experience. And I can give you a lot of examples that tourists actually told us of this high value experience. Basic, of course, but clean, comfortable places to stay. But they come to Bhutan not to experience 5 stars, because they're coming to places where they have better 5 stars than us. But they want to experience the local 5-star. So I think that's the concept we're trying to get into people here in Bhutan. If you're coming back to support the national objective of 5-star, this is what we should be thinking at. When you say 5-star, high value, please just don't look at the hotels. We have the local 5-star, and that is exactly what the tourists are coming to experience when we are in Bhutan, and we must ensure that they get this experience. So that's a big challenge, of course, ahead of us for the government. Of course, we are also part of government, the Tourism Council of Bhutan, but exciting, and then of course also exciting times ahead, but also a lot of challenges ahead. So thank you once again, Doctor.
So thank you, Mr. Rinzin. Now we have to move a little bit to geopolitics. And Mr. Pant, you're the international relations expert joining us today. So India and China are the leading markets for leading source markets for tourism in Nepal. It appears now that Nepal is trying to maintain its foreign policy balance while not subscribing to any of these camps that exist in the South Asian region. Can the medium of tourism be used for reaching out to other nations in South Asia or even to the US in order for Nepal to meet its geopolitical goals? Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Shahid. So talking about China, talking about China and India, and talking about a tourism perspective, if India and China are the primary source of tourists in Nepal, and if you go beyond South Asia to Western or European tourists, that doesn't necessarily make the geopolitical balance, because if you talk about Nepal, Nepal is surrounded by India and China the world's two largest, fastest growing economy, and so series of new developments is coming in Nepal. If you talk, I would like to link this with latest development in Nepal. So after the NCC, the Millennium Challenge Corporation, endorsed by the Parliament, it's a development project funded by the United States of $500 million to construct an infrastructure of road and transmission line, electricity. So it was a huge outcry in Nepal, led by the communist forces in Nepal, and we know that communist by nature, they are more tilted to China, and China is a communist-dominated country. And there was a huge outcry, the mass protests, but ultimately the Western American lobby played a role, and MCC endorsed by the Parliament. And after the MCC endorsement in Nepal, there are a series of US visits to Nepal, including the visit of Assistant Secretary, and they also met with the Tibetan leader, exiled Tibetan refugee camps in Nepal. So Nepal's government believes in one China policies and doesn't entertain any Tibetan issues in Nepal. So this is, and to that, our Prime Minister is planning to visit the United States in July, followed by SPP, the State Partnership Program, that came into limelight. It was a deal conducted in 2015 when we had a large earthquake in Nepal. So that deal was primarily for military partnership to rescue people during disaster, and to equip Nepali army with helicopters and Skytruck. But as the issues came, the Indo-Pacific strategy came after Trump's arrival, and it got messed with. And the left political parties in Nepal, they twisted the things, and they did a politics by saying that Nepal ultimately went to the American camp of Indo-Pacific strategy, and Nepal is now finally supporting US vested interest in Indo-Pacific region. So these are the things. So tourism, I think tourism is a very small portion here. The larger than life thing in Nepal, in this area, is dominated by the geopolitical things. That is ultimately for US, ultimately balancing India and China to maintain its dominance, and for China to be a regional hegemon, ultimately become superpower, and for India to become a South Asian hegemon, and ultimately go for a global hegemon. So from my perspective, though, there will be little differentiate when you go for like diversification in tourism, but we can explore this issue in a way that Nepal can be a potential, if you twist these things to a different dimension, that if we play if you make our Nepal for like diplomatic or business destination like Geneva, then tourism could play a bigger role in balancing Nepal's vested interest, in preserving Nepal's vested interest, and Nepal's safety and survival in this highly volatile world. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Dr. Samaratunga, we are seeing the situation, the terrible situation in Sri Lanka, and there are, many changes taking place at this point in time. I was wondering, is there a sort of organizational structure the international community should make to encourage sustainable tourism development? Looking at the case of Sri Lanka, can the establishment of more global or regional organizations help to respond more effectively in localized contexts?
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Shahid, for the very important question. Now, yeah, Sri Lanka is badly in need of some reshapes and the reforms, and we really need to look back out of our institutional structure, organizational structures, and what policies that we implemented so far, and establishing a kind of a international center, either internationally or regionally, that will make a due influence to the entire South Asian region is very much important at this context, that to come over the trouble that we are facing right of now. And now when talking about the sustainable development goals, and our work so far has been progressive, but to my personal understanding, it has not been very effective. If we had actively participated in attending to the sustainable development goals, and we wouldn't have made this type of a crisis. So having an international organization is important to monitor the existing mechanisms in Sri Lanka, and how our loans being employed. Are they really implementing to alleviate the poverty of the people, and are they really feeding the local communities, rural communities? We need to look at, and we need to make sure that everyone is getting the power, right? So a monitoring mechanism is very much important, top of the hierarchy, right? And making the due kind of a mediation into each and every international donations we are receiving, and the implementation of it, and the transparency need to be looked at. And again, when talking about the sustainable development goals, and with respect to the poverty alleviation, we need to look at the skills development of the vulnerable groups, especially the women and the youth, right? And their educational structure, what they're learning, and how can they use their existing knowledge and the education to make some living, right? So educational reforms is a must at this juncture, very much important. And we also need to I really like the points raised by Mr. Rinsin about the sustainable development of the Bhutan, how they have done it so far. And Sri Lanka also need to look at this triple bottom line philosophy to protect the people, protect the environment, planet, and protect to ensure the sustainable profit. It is not only about we surviving today, but also we need to ensure the future generation also getting the benefits out of the limited resources we are having. We also need to do more research to conduct a proper assessment of the present economic crisis, what went wrong, and how the vulnerable communities really affected. So an international organization, which is an independent body, can play a bigger role in that regards, because at the current current situation, I cannot keep the trust on any of the government agencies, to be frank. So international mediation is what is needed, and that is what the protesters in front of the President's Secretariat office is also saying. And health and well-being is very much important, so the international organizations have to look into that. The increase in malnutrition among the pregnant mothers, feeding mothers, and the children, including the infants, is palpable these days, right? Because the things are really expensive, including the eggs, including the meat, including all the protein items. So the at least maybe UNICEF and World Health Organization have to make a kind of a influence with the recommendation of a kind of an organization. I mean, if we had a kind of an international organization that focusing the Sri Lanka's objectives, Sri Lanka's roads and the developments towards the sustainable development goals, the implementation mechanism would be easier. And again, it is important that the Sri Lanka having some access to free resources, learning materials, e-resources, right? To inculcate, to promote the international educations, to empower the local communities, right? And because now we have the internet, but sometimes the access to e-resources is very much limited. Now we cannot access to the Elsevier or whatever the prestige databases, because we don't have dollars to pay. So the education is also at a kind of a vulnerable sector. So So they are the, and again, very much importantly, if we can establish a kind of an international center that also should promote the innovations and the creative thinking and the entrepreneurship through which we can earn more dollars, bring more dollars back to the country. So there are some of the main things that comes to my mind, that we can get this through which we can get the support of an international organization that you are just proposed.
Thank you so much, Dr. Samaratunga. So now, we are over time, and we have to go to our closing round. So I would like to ask all of you in this closing round, this one question that I had, which is, what big challenges lie ahead for creating a sustainable tourism framework where the US and other Western nations can help each country that we've been talking about to reach its sustainable tourism goals? So first of all, Dr. Shakila, you can give us the Maldivian perspective, then to Mr. Rinzin about Bhutan, then Mr. Pant for Nepal, and then finally to Dr. Samaratunga for Sri Lanka. Thank you. So Dr. Shakila.
Thank you. So tourism is highly unbalanced when we consider developed countries such as the United States, Western countries, and the emerging economies. So we are comparing apples and oranges here. There is a lot of space here for the developed countries, as Samaratunga has just talked about, to facilitate action at the grassroots level. Looking at the current climate of Sri Lanka, that is. But also looking at the COVID pandemic and the second crisis that we are talking about, climate change, the sharing of knowledge and building adaptive capacity for these emerging economies would go a long way to help these countries.
Is it me now?
Hello.
That is your turn?
Hello, Dr. Shakila.
Yes.
We just lost you for a couple of seconds. So can you repeat?
What did I do? Maybe even the computer is sleeping. So I said that the knowledge and adaptive capacity building should really be helpful for the countries that we are talking about here, the emerging economies in island destinations.
Thank you. And then to Mr. Rinzin.
Yes, thank you. I think very similar along the similar lines to Dr. Shakila. I think capacity building of the emerging economies, the developing countries, would be actually one of the key areas in terms of moving forward post-COVID, because a lot of countries affected by COVID really look at rebuilding their capacities. And I was talking to some of our colleagues in the industry and how they have lost people, and some of them actually lost touch with what they had actually learned in skills. So that would be actually one area that probably could help. The other one is, of course, the developed countries would have actually a lot more disposable income. The other help that they could do is come and visit places like Bhutan and Maldives and Nepal and Sri Lanka. So that's the other thing that I want to share. And with this, thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you so much, Mr. Rinzin. Mr. Pant?
So thank you, Dr. Shahid. So for big challenges, when you talk about the big challenges in Nepal, so I would like to link this with the climate change of broader perspective, because Nepal is vulnerable to climate change, and though Nepal is not responsible for the climate change in Nepal, the high mountains, the melting of glacier, the avalanches, they are creating floods and disasters in the lower terrain of Nepal. And also the second thing is that the tourism sector is semi-formalized in Nepal. The waste products generated by tourism hasn't been disposed properly. Second thing. And so regarding how Western countries could help and bring sustainable tourism in Nepal is that it's already being supported by Western countries from a few decades. I already told about tourism poverty alleviation project going on in early in 2001, 2006 in Dolba in high altitude to the Terai region. And also like, so how to empower communities in current context is that we need to do a capacity build-up training from a low grassroots to higher level. Next is like formalizing. This sector is very semi-formalized, so we need to make formalized. We need to register all the informal workers of the tourism sector that will provide them with the social security safety nets, and also that will provide government to a lot of amount of tax, and also that providing seed grants to the newly young tourism entrepreneurs who want to do something, and also the digitalization of the tourism sector. So these 4 or 5 areas where Western countries could help to mitigate the disasters created by the environment, tourism sector. Thank you so much.
Dr. Samaratunga?
Thank you, Dr. Shahid. I think even during the previous question, I explained much things about the international mediation and the framework within which we can achieve the heights of sustainable development goals. Adding to that, I also jump back to the triple bottom line philosophy. We need to protect the people, we need to protect the planet, and we need to have a sustainable profit for the well-being of the local community. So when talking about that, achieving those things have been challenging era for Sri Lanka because of the resource limitation. So we see Sri Lanka, just in a nutshell, when we first introduced the open economic policies in 1977, no, Sri Lanka was not ready, and now we see the situation. So the Sri Lanka situation is not a result of the last 2 to 3 years impact, but it's 2 to 3 decades the bad handling and the mismanagement kind of a thing. So we need to have a kind of a good, conducive and a holistic framework to promote the sustainability, right, through which the resources can be allocated efficiently, and we need to have the political stability, and we need to promote the local production, right, and again the sectors like tourism, and we need to, especially there is a huge leakage in Sri Lanka because of the tourism, because most of the food items available in the Sri Lankan buffets are again imported. So we need to change the overall the structure that we are having as of now, right? So we need to have a very clear and a brand new kind of a structure here in Sri Lanka to get over this problem, right? So yeah, thank you, Doctor.
Thank you, Dr. Samaratunga. So now we're at the end of the program, and I would like to begin by thanking you, our guests, of course, and you have set aside your time and shared your expertise. So thank you so much, Dr. Aishat Shakila, Dr. Manoj Samaratunga, Mr. Saurav Rajpant, and Mr. Damcho Rinzin. I would also like to thank Dr. Irfan Nuruddin, Senior Director of the South Asia Center, for giving us this platform. For the logistics behind this session, I would like to thank Mr. Haris Samad, the Assistant Director of the South Asia Center, and of course, Ms. Misha Iqbal, who is the program assistant of the South Asia Center, and the entire team at the center for organizing this webinar. To get updated on the geopolitics of South Asia, we invite all our viewers to check out the South Asia Center's website, which has many commentaries and briefs on the region, as well as yearly and mid-yearly reports on the different countries of the region. Finally, thank you to our audience for patiently listening to us. And many of you are based in the US, of course, and in South Asia, and of course, around the world, all the way to Australia. So thank you for patiently listening to us. Take care and be safe. Bye.
Thank you.
Okay, bye.
Thank you. Goodbye.